No, we're looking for freedom. We're looking for freedom. That's the only thing.
Every single thing that our governments have done, it just keeps on getting worse.
Against lockdowns and mandatory vaccinations in workplaces.
Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. And we feel like there's a lot of fraud going on here. And as a business owner, I've done really well under Trump.
Ain't nobody gonna tell me how to live.
Freedom, 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 oi! Freedom, 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 oi!
Welcome back once again to Left Below. To get the boilerplate out of the way, like, subscribe, leave a comment below, give me a follow on Twitter. Help a small channel out. Okay, stop me if you've heard this one before. The Democrats, the left, the socialists, whomever, they're the party of big government, the censors, the oppressors, the busybodies, whatever pejorative synonym for authoritarian you can think of. Now, before anyone says it, no, I'm not talking about actual communist dictatorships when I rebut that point. Anyone with any sense knows that's not what the American left is outside of a few terminally online weirdos. But the right wing loves to make that point over and over again. Why? Because everyone wants to be a rebel. Like, sure, Darth Vader has swag, but if you asked any kid growing up, they'd say they wanted to be in the Rebel Alliance. In our civics, too, the American founding myth is about rebellion. Even if somebody really thinks like Goliath, they're going to tell you they're David because everybody wants to be David. And why not, man? David really got around. Anyway, the right wing loves to act like they're the rebels, the lonely truth-tellers out there fighting against the forces of evil. Now, it's one thing to tell conservatives that they're wrong. That's like a rite of passage across LeftTube. But can you really tell someone that they aren't a rebel? Seems like a paradox at first glance. Does being a rebel really have qualifications other than fighting against authority? This video is going to take a look at what being a rebel is to pick up some criteria, and then is going to set those criteria against a few right-wing movements that have taken on a rebel identity to see whether or not that identity holds up. You can probably guess from the title of this video, but think of it like a Columbo episode or Knives Out. The fun here is following the arc to the inevitable conclusion. So let's get ready to play America's favorite 9-inning pastime, Rebel or Reactionary. Our contestants up today are the Confederate States of America and all the lost cause white supremacists who followed them. Don't hold your breath. It's the anti-vax and anti-maskers. And finally, everyone's favorite group of Capitol tourists, the January 6th rioters. Up against them, rebellion is going to be defined by the James Dean of French existentialist philosophy, Albert Camus. In one of his treatises, The Rebel, he works through the philosophy of rebellion and what it really means. There's a lot more to it than what I'm about to break down here. If you're at all into philosophy, I'd really recommend reading it yourself, but I picked out 8 points from The Rebel that speak to his definition of rebellion. So first I'll explain the point, and then break it down by comparing it to neo-Confederates, vax skeptics, and J6ers, and see how they stack up. Also, to dodge any issues with the YouTube algorithm, I'm going to call the second group the AV Club. Point 1. Rebellion is an assertion of something fundamentally human, something that defines us individually but also speaks to a broader human nature. Camus was an absurdist, which you could kind of describe as optimistic nihilism. If you've heard of the myth of Sisyphus, you may have heard of this tagline, "We must imagine Sisyphus as happy." The actual myth of Sisyphus is about a rebel against the Greek gods who is damned to roll a boulder up a hill for all eternity. The hill was too steep for him to ever finish. It would always slip loose of him and roll back down the hill. So to imagine him as happy is a pretty radical idea. As Sisyphus found happiness in his walk down the hill, humans too could find simple meaning in defying their place in the world. Confederates and racism in general do not assert anything fundamental about the person holding the view. Their whole basis behind their viewpoint is that the white people hold a special privilege over people of color, especially black people. It's not about fundamental humanity, it's just about them defending their social status. The AV Club. Here you could make the argument along the lines of bodily autonomy. They assert that nobody has the right to tell another person that they must inject something into their bodies or suffer the loss of other rights. So, gotta give this one a pass. J6ers. Their assertion is that their votes weren't counted, or that the popular will was subverted due to broken election laws. The latter is obviously patently untrue, but this point doesn't address whether or not believing in a lie justifies rebellion, so I'm gonna slap a question mark on this one. Point 2. The act of rebellion carries him far beyond the point he had reached by simply refusing. He now demands to be treated as an equal. This is the one that right-wing rebellion fails generally. A lot of conservative grievance is built on resentment, and more on that later, and fighting against others achieving equality. Reactionary movements push back against those pushing for justice. They're centered around denying others something they feel belongs exclusively to their in-group. Whether or not conservatives fight for that as a popular movement that looks like a rebellion if you squint at it right, or fight from the halls of power, is irrelevant. Confederates say they fight for states' rights, and the easy response is, a state's right to what? The AV Club, here they're demanding special treatment from authority. Public health authorities don't reserve the right to refuse vaccines. Skeptics want that right for themselves, solely. J6ers. The question here is still muddled by the fantasy world this movement lives in. They believe that their votes are not being counted properly, or that liberal votes are being counted improperly. If you read between the lines enough, what they want are the voter suppression rules from before the push for mail-in voting during the pandemic to be restored. So again, to make it harder to vote, and are making it harder to vote in many states as I write this. Point 3. Rebellion is an all-or-nothing act, a willingness to sacrifice everything for the sense of an inalienable right that you've found within yourself. This is one that every strong ideological movement has in its favor, regardless of its spot on the political map. The point where you could use Camus' language to knock against right-wingers here is that he says inalienable right, whereas what right-wingers are usually fighting for are privileges, not rights, regardless of what they may contend. But I'll be generous here and give all three a pass on this. Reaction and rebellion both call for an all-or-nothing approach, but the critical difference is going to be discussed soon. Point 4. The rebels' assertion establishes a natural community of humanity, including between the oppressor and the oppressed. Point 4 follows point 2 in what I pulled from Camus' thinking. A rebel isn't looking to dominate their oppressor. They fight because they recognize themselves in their oppressor, recognize that the only thing separating them from their oppressor is the oppression itself. This is another thing that's usually wanting in right-wing movements that call themselves rebellions. Confederates again don't assert a natural community of anything. What they assert is white supremacy. Their problem is seeing equality as oppression, that when racial equality is the law of the land, this is a violation of their privilege to discriminate. They only see a community with other white people. AV Club members defy the natural community of humanity in a very naturalistic sense. In a philosophical sense, you can make the argument that what they want is for everyone to be able to make a personal choice about what vaccines they're supposed to take, but this collides with how the reality of contagious diseases work. Mass vaccination is how we recognize the humanity in each other in this case. Even though any given sickness would only take a certain portion of the population, we all contribute to help more people survive. J6ers are the right-wing rebel movement that wants to reverse the oppression they claim to be facing. While they claim they're fighting for a fair democracy, in practice, the attack on the US Capitol was a transparent attempt to overthrow that democracy by force, and they would not have been merciful victors. Point 5. Rebellion is not founded in resentment, which leads to unscrupulous ambition or bitterness. The rebel does not seek to conquer and does not want to see his enemies suffer. Indeed, the rebel sees an injustice done to his enemy as a wrong as one done to himself. Told you resentment would come back. Camus spends a good chunk of the rebel talking about everyone's favorite bad boy philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche, who talked a lot about resentment in his Genealogy of Morals. Without getting too sidetracked, Nietzsche said early Christianity worked to overthrow the master morality of the Greco-Roman world, of the virtues of beauty, wealth, conquest, and strength. They replaced this with slave morality, blessed are the poor, the meek, etc. But this led to resentment of those positive traits. This ties back to Camus and back to point 4. Rebellion is not founded in resentment because it's not about envying what other people have. It's about wanting the same rights and the same dignity for everyone. Conservatism is about the opposite of that, jealously defending the rights and privileges you have at best, and often reveling in the suffering of their enemies or those they consider beneath them. What passes for Republican policy these days is own the libs any way you can. Confederacy and white supremacy in the U.S. in general is deeply founded in resentment. How many times in your life have you heard, "It's hard to be a straight white man in America nowadays"? It's one hell of a cognitive dissonance that they resent and envy people who they also think are inferior to them, but it's etched all over their conduct. With the AV Club, it's a bit more complicated. There is a dose of envy there, and for this I'm going to bogart a random Twitter thread, because these are as the Greek agoras for the free exchange of ideas in our day. Nothing in this thread will be news to people of color, and the views posted in this thread are not original. Isabel Wilkerson, who wrote the book Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent, greatly informed my understanding of caste. The moment that it was understood that COVID-19 disproportionately affects communities of color, the immunocompromised, and other vulnerable populations, Donald Trump's base decided that the viral pandemic was acceptable. The reality: Donald Trump's base has a sense of occupying the dominant caste. They want to think of COVID-19 as a lower caste issue, and the dominant caste being forced to go out of its way to protect people perceived as lower in caste is a supreme violation of caste rules. J6ers are also a resentful bunch, thinking that the game is rigged in favor of Democrats and seeing their insurrection as just leveling the playing field. Part and parcel for conservatives who refuse to see how stacked society is in their favor. Point 6. Rebellion is not purely individualistic. It bridges the individual and the communal. Camus continues to hammer on the point that rebellion is not purely selfish. When he says "not purely" here, what he means is that rebellion doesn't have to be selfless either. You can want better things for yourself. In fact, as earlier points showed, rebellion originates with finding something lacking in yourself, in a bad personal experience, but quickly evolves into that shared sense of humanity. Of course, Confederates and their ilk don't care about common humanity, but their goals are purely selfish even among white people. If you look back at the old Confederacy, the driving force was an elite minority that was doing nothing to make the lives of poor whites better. White supremacy has always been about the individuals who benefit from it. The AV Club is deeply individualistic. Like the point above talking about caste and their resentment over the idea that they have to do something to protect lower caste people, it also comes down to plain laziness and lack of consideration for others. It goes the same way with anti-masking or any of the other things that people blithely ignored and continue to ignore as the pandemic rolls on. Any effort on their part is too much to ask for. Club members are uniquely selfish among wannabe rebel movements. The January 6th movement, I think it fits in with the first point. If you were deluded enough to believe the election was actually stolen, then there is a communal element to what they were doing. This one gets another question mark. Point 7. Man's solidarity is founded upon rebellion, and rebellion, in its turn, can only find its justification in this solidarity. Now, Camus almost repeating himself here, but that's something you have to deal with a lot in philosophy, similar points restated in different phrasings. But for this one, I'm going to focus on solidarity. The Confederacy is like the furthest thing from solidarity. The settler type of colonialism in general is, and that's where the American brand of white supremacy comes from. Settler colonialism, first of all, deprives indigenous peoples of their land. Second of all, relies either on a slave or poverty wage underclass if they're using a plantation or other kind of resource extraction economy. And thirdly, builds an unequal, individualistic society among the settlers themselves. The AV Club is a deeply unempathetic lot. Look no further here than former Republican presidential candidate, Pokemon movie quoter, and ultimately COVID victim Herman Cain. When he died of COVID in the summer of 2020, his social media managers kept on tweeting about COVID denialism. His death didn't matter a whit to them, only the continued cause of fighting against public health, against being asked to do a damn thing for their fellow man. That was all that mattered to them. And you can see that in countless other anecdotes across the pandemic. Families of AVers who died, and yet the relatives blithely carry on, unchanged. The J6ers have a hilarious lack of solidarity, even among their own ranks. All that needs to be said are how many of them have been ratted out by friends and family, how rapidly they've turned on Trump for not supporting them after the insurrection, how their lawyers have blamed Fox News and other right-wing propaganda outlets. These are not people who stand up for what they believe in. So not only are they not expressing solidarity, they're also breaking another tenet discussed earlier, that rebellion is an all-or-nothing act. Point 8. The rebel is a man who is on the point of accepting or rejecting the sacred, and is determined on laying claim to a human situation in which all the answers are human. Here Camus is focused on how moving on from the old religions as the source of morality involves more than just professing atheism. It involves moving on to a moral and ethical way of thinking that does not put anything up on an altar, not just a god or an idol, but human reason or scientific truth. The rebel is not just rebelling against the legal authority of the master, they're rebelling against the idea of any authority that stands above that common humanity. Hence, a human situation in which all answers are human. For the American right wing, there's obviously a lot of extremist Christianity baked into their way of thinking, but they've also elevated more secular idols, too. White supremacy has a mixture of both. The religious parts of it come from parts of the Bible urging slaves to obey their masters, and a kookier theological idea about black people being afflicted by the mark of Cain or the curse of Ham, saying that they are somehow diminished in the eyes of God due to the sins of a common ancestor. On the secular side, white supremacy invented race theory in the 19th century as a way to fight back against Enlightenment theories that put slavery and imperialism in a bad light. Race theory was a twisted, pseudo-scientific take on Darwinism, and put the races in a hierarchy with white people at the top. However, because it looked like science if you squinted at it, it was put up on an altar beyond reproach, similar to the Word of God. The AV Club also has a very strong religious line running through them from the anti-medicine perspective that's often run through Christianity, that you're interfering with God's plan by boosting your immunity via vaccination, while those who aren't settling on the religious justification are settling on some kind of woo-loo, new age pseudo-nonsense. The J6ers have a link with the QAnon movement, which is deeply religious, albeit in a very bizarre way that has no grounding in Christian scripture. So many times on Twitter last year, before they started purging those accounts, you'd see people with God wins in their bio. Somewhere along the line, Q's plan got conflated with God's plan, and there you go. On the more secular front, they've idealized the idea of an American nation in the fascist model, that the nation is by and for white Christian men, and that elections that undermine this are therefore illegitimate. Any rebellion that eschews human solidarity is an acquiescence to murder. This line is more important in the text of the rebel itself in seeking to establish the philosophical perils of defying or undermining traditional moral authority. He addresses the argument that without God, there's nobody to tell us what's right and wrong, and then suddenly we're all Mad Maxing everywhere. He took great pains to address how some rebellions in metaphysics and literature led to the idea that anything is permitted and that there is nothing compelling humans to be good. He sought to construct an argument for how you could leave behind the old morality without abandoning any sense of right and wrong. In short, he found the answer in humanity, just like in the last point, a human situation where the answers are human. This one isn't rated on a success-fail metric, just whether or not the movement condones murder. White supremacy definitely condones murder. Thanks to the Black Lives Matter movement, their names resonate across America like they did in the summer of 2020. But the end result of the malformed rebellion of the Confederates and their descendants was a bloody civil war first, and then countless lynchings and lynchings in the guise of law enforcement in the years since. Murder. The AV Club movement doesn't quite get there. There's an immense amount of unnecessary death that can be laid at the feet of those who refused and continue to refuse to comply and think of this as freedom. But they also don't determine who specifically dies, especially because so much of the excess deaths are among their own ranks. Manslaughter. The J6 movement has thankfully not led to significant death toll yet, though in our modern culture of stochastic lone wolf terrorism and America's continued Swiss cheese gun laws, it's only a matter of time. Only one Capitol Police officer died on that fateful day, but other deaths were among their own ranks. From the recent arrest of Oath Keepers founder Stuart Rhodes, we can see that they were definitely planning to escalate the violence during and after the insurrection. Murder. So to run it back. Point 1, an assertion of something fundamentally human, something that defines us individually but also speaks to human nature. Confederates fail, Vax skeptics pass, J6ers uncertain. Point 2, the act of rebellion carries him far beyond the point that he had reached by simply refusing. He now demands to be treated as an equal. Fails across the board. Point 3, rebellion is an all-or-nothing act, a willingness to sacrifice everything for the sense of an inalienable right that you found within yourself. Pass across the board. The gimme. Point 4. The rebel's assertion establishes a natural community of humanity, including between the oppressor and the oppressed. Fails across the board. Point 5. Rebellion is not founded in resentment. Fails across the board. Point 6. Rebellion is not purely individualistic, it bridges the individual and the communal. Fails for the Confederates and the AV Club, a question mark for J6ers. Point 7. Solidarity. Fails across the board. Point 8. Determination to lay claim to a situation where all answers are human. Fails across the board. Point 9. Confederates and J6ers acquiesce to murder. The AV Club only acquiesces to manslaughter. In the end, the AV Club is the closest to being a genuine rebel movement, but only 1 point further than our other two examples of right-wing rebellion. They are also indirectly killing people through their beliefs, rather than directly killing them. The question marks for the J6ers is less addressed by the criteria here. They're diluted, more diluted in their justification for what they're doing than the other two, setting aside some insanity in the AV Club. What is the philosophical claim if you genuinely believe in a lie? Regardless, it's clear however many "don't tread on me" flags you fly on your property, if you're a right-winger, you are not a rebel. Thank you all for watching. Going to try switching from Sony Vegas to DaVinci Resolve for the next one to keep improving my game. The next video will be back on the media analysis side of things, but other than that, it's open season. Till next time.